Hello, welcome back to On the Mic with Mike. I am Mike Jarvis, and in this edition, I am so pleased, even proud to say that I am joined for a discussion on an important cultural matter for the Caribbean that is very current as we speak. The person I'll be speaking with in this edition is none other than the Dominican cultural icon, the one and only. If I say Exile One, you'll know I'm talking about Gordon Henderson. Hello, Gordon.
Hi, what's up?
What's up? What's up indeed? You know, Gordon, what's up and what's quite interesting, just a few days ago, date 13th of February, 2025, I got one of those Facebook memory reminder things that popped up on the 13th of February and reminded me that on that date, I borrowed, quote unquote, a post that you had made, I think around that time, in which you raised a very important question. Where did Dominicans get the idea that Madras was Dominican? This year, in Antigua and Barbuda, and I had an interview with a representative, a director of the Museum of Antigua and Barbuda in the previous podcast. In Antigua, I'm sure you probably are aware of that, they are having a national debate, a national consultation on whether or not they should change the national dress from the Madras to the Kente, the West African slash Ghanaian Kente. So I'm either going to blame you for all of this or hold you responsible for all of this or credit you for all of this. What say you, Mr. Henderson?
Well, I would like to take the blame. I would like to take the blame because um, in the Caribbean, well, I would like to say in the Creole Caribbean. And when I say Creole, I am not necessarily referring to the Creole speaking, because as you know, the word Creole has encountered numerous semantic shifts. You know, a Creole used to be a European born in the colonies. At one point, it was a horse, Creola. It became a language, it became a culture. So, in some of the lesser Antilles, we have had the tendency of adopting the Madras fabric as something of our own. And at the same time, some of the people who wear it proudly as such are, I don't want to say anti-colonial, but they do not want to celebrate colonialism. And wearing the Madras is doing just that. Let's put it that way.
And quite interestingly, I noticed that you referred to the Madras as a fabric. Okay, I'm across this issue quite a bit now, particularly, in a Montserrat situation, but even wider because it's a debate now that is gaining increasing momentum across the Caribbean. The Madras itself, it's not the design, is it? The Madras is the fabric that originated in Madras, India, which is now Chennai. So am I correct with that? It is the fabric. The design is more of a Scottish tartan. Like, for example, in Barbados, they have a Barbadian tartan, a sort of a plaid design that clearly they admit is inherited or imported from Scottish backgrounds.
This is totally correct. Totally correct. The Madras is above all a fabric, and the design that we may say that Africans and descendants of Africans seem to like, probably because it is cotton. But the designs and the rich colors may have attracted Africans. There is another fabric called wax, called Dutch wax, and it is even called African wax print that looks something like the Madras, but in fact it is Dutch. I bring that up because there's a big debate in Africa, in many of the African countries, where people are drawing to the attention of the populace that wax is not African. It was adopted by Africa, but it comes from the Netherlands, and the Netherlands themselves, being part of the colonial system, they picked it up from some part of Asia, but they became famous for manufacturing and exporting it to Africa, and Africa became the biggest market. Um, my mind is trained to, it's almost like Italy and pasta.
Okay.
Italians love pasta so much that we would forget that the Italians got it from the Chinese. It's the same thing as what they call the African wax print. It is not African. We may say that it is Dutch. It comes from the Netherlands. Similarly, the Madras is not Caribbean. And even if the in some of the countries, we know that Indians came after the abolition of slavery as indentured servants, but everybody was wearing their madras by then. So the Indians didn't bring the madras to the Caribbean. The British did.
Quite interesting. Let me throw you back to that post that you made, that post from then that has resonated down through the past, well, coming to the past decade now. Even though you might have focused on Dominica, it has a much wider context. Where did Dominicans, or where the Caribbean, get the idea that Madras was Dominican or Caribbean oriented? What was your thought process? What was it that triggered that?
Well, in Dominica, which is practically the same situation in the, say, the Leeward Islands, in Martinique and Guadeloupe, French overseas departments. People slowly are starting to get back to their roots. I think that we're in a period where people want to find out what is truly Caribbean and what is not. And I was in Dominica at the time at the National Day period, Independence period in Dominica, which is very well celebrated. It is, the entire country is involved. But the entire country is dressed in madras. And I just didn't want to be a part. No, I have nothing against madras. I think that it is okay. It is cotton. It's usually in bright colors. We like bright colors, but we should not teach another generation that this is our fabric and this is something that we inherited from Africa, because the word Africa comes up when we speak of tradition. And this makes me think to respond to your question more directly. I think that there is a notion in the Caribbean that we imported a number of cultural traits from Africa. And to use some of my grandparents' language, I think that common sense would prove that we did not import much of our cultural traits from Africa simply because the enslaved African was spread out. We know that one of the main things that we can use as an example, there is no African language spoken anywhere in the Caribbean. And there's no history of any Swahili or whatever spoken and lost over the centuries.
You know, that is a very interesting and insightful observation because what we know from and of the history is that the people who were kidnapped from Africa and brought to the Caribbean were people from different regions around West Africa and a bit coming down the South African, the coast, the southern coast of Africa. And they were all people of different backgrounds. They have their own cultures, their own norms, their own languages, and maybe strategically for control purposes, they were just all lumped together. Well, you know, you all are the same skin color anyway, and we need the manpower and woman power. And when you were dumped on an island in the Caribbean, you had people from different African backgrounds and different African traditions, but whatever traditions that they would have brought with them, that was quite literally beaten out of them. Let's be frank.
Well, that's a fact. That's a fact because there are two circumstances that we need to pay attention to. One is the wide variety of tribalism in the soft definition of the word. Um, so they were mixed, but I think that they were deliberately separated to avoid plotting because we noticed that on the slave plantation, communication, we have accounts of rebellions, historians like to call it, from Jamaica, Morant Bay, and we have the Neg Mahon in Dominica, and so to prevent communication and plotting, I think that the slave master purposefully separated people who could communicate. And this is why in the beginning of our conversation, I mentioned Creole. Creole in all its aspects, but Creole as a language began on the slave plantation. And one of the reasons that I bring that up is because in my research, I am a fanatic of ethnomusicology, and I noticed that we didn't import any African musical pattern or genre either. Well, first of all, I don't think that the slave master wanted to import musicians anyway.
Well, you know something, you are leading us on to an issue that I am going to want to follow up with you about music, the origins of our music in the Caribbean, and how much of it is actually Caribbean oriented, yes, it would have influences from all over, and certain influences would have been transferred from Africa by the various cultural groups who were taken across to the Caribbean. Well, that's a fantastic discussion. I'm going to want to follow that up with you. Let me just focus a bit now on what is happening in Antigua, at least at the official level now in Antigua. And I gather that there seems to be a momentum building up elsewhere to have a rethink, a review of what constitutes national symbols, national identity, and in this case, the national dress, to make a change from, or to have a second look at, should we retain the MADRAS as the national dress, or should it be the Kente? What do you think about that move in Antigua, or that move by Antigua?
I think Antiguans, I would urge them to go towards the Kinte and abandon the Madras for the simple reason that the Madras doesn't have any authentic, there's no empirical proof that the Madras has any direct connection to any one of us, be it Montserrat, Antigua, Dominica, um, Martinique, and Guadeloupe, despite the fact that Martinique and Guadeloupe, or even Trinidad, there are Indian communities. So if we are moving away from colonialism, we have been independent since the 60s, back and forth. Um, well, I know in Montserrat, Montserrat is independent thinking anyway.
Independent thinking. Good way of putting it.
Yeah, yeah, I know that because I listen to the calypsos when we think of Arrow and we think of what's going on. Um, so, but to get back to the subject, the Madras should be held as a token of the past. But Africa, we cannot deny Africa. And taking any symbol with African roots would make better historical sense, better cultural sense, in my opinion.
And what do you think then about moving it a step further? Just going back on a few points that you made there about our Caribbean identity. Do you were referring to the musical aspect of it, or the music aspect of it? What then would you say would constitute a Caribbean identity, okay, with probably some variations, island by island or country by country for the independent ones, pertaining to a national dress that projects a Caribbean identity? Because if we speak to the Kente, we are speaking principally of Ghana in West Africa, but even within there, my research is, pointing out to me, oh, there are several variations of the kente for ceremonial purposes, etc. And the colors have a meaning, and the designs have a meaning, and Nigeria has a pattern, and Equatorial Guinea has a pattern, and Senegal has their own pattern. So it requires a lot of research. So if you're taking all of that together, and looking then at our Caribbean history, our Caribbean identity, what would you, given your cultural involvement, your involvement and interest in history, what would you propose for a Caribbean national dress, as it were?
I think that today we need a round table, and whatever is selected would have to be, I hesitate in using the word African because Africa is so broad. And as you mentioned, the whole Gold Coast area, there is so much diversity. So we could select in a democratic way, select a symbol that we think we can relate to. Um, Many years ago, I visited the country of Benin, and although Caribbean people always refer to Senegal as a port of departure, but I saw things in Benin that reminded me, the general comportment of the people, the way we behave, the way we relate to certain things. Um, I felt that the people in Benin were closer to Caribbean people in terms of behavior than Senegal. So I think we can take a broad look of this formerly called Gold Coast area and select something that we can relate to, but it will still remain a symbol because we are a diverse people in the Caribbean. Speaking of music, I remember going to Gabon in Africa with Exile One, and the bass player was taller than every one of us. And everybody referred to him, well, in French, le mandingue, meaning the mandingo. So since tribes are very important in Africa, even today, Vivian Wallace, everybody referred to him as the mandingo.
Wow.
And so this struck me, and probably with a round table with the necessary research, we can find a symbol that we can relate to.
Well, I'm going to leave you to pull that together because you are the person who is like the entire engine room being, I have no problem referring to you as a cultural icon, not only in terms of your involvement with music and Exile One, which we will also have to talk about, but also your involvement in the broad spectrum of the fascinating cultural life of Dominica. So, and to have that very broad Caribbean umbrella outreach to have that definition of what could be or what could be regarded as a starting point for a pattern, a dress, a national dress, a mode of design that could be identifiably Caribbean. You're the best man to start the ball rolling. Let me refer to something else here, Gordon, pertaining to this whole discussion about the MADRAS. Should it be, should it not be, should it continue to be, or should it be shifted to something more Africa oriented? And that is particularly for the Africa descended people in the Caribbean. Used to wear a dashiki, right? I had a dashiki, and I'm sure
Mhm.
I've seen of some photos of you on your Exile One album covers in a dashiki.
Yeah.
Right. So I've been checking up because I think in terms of something that was identifiably or popularly Caribbean, or at least popular in the Caribbean back in the 1970s, was the dashiki. And before I get to my other point, it raises the question: whatever became of the dashiki in the Caribbean? Why has it practically fallen out of fashion? We don't see it now as much as we used to. Whatever happened?
Well, I think that in the 70s, there was a move towards Africa. with the Black Power movement in the United States. Now, we in the Caribbean, we look to the United States for guidance towards identity. We had just moved into independence, most of the countries. So the Black Power movement was very important in our minds. And when I say our minds, I'm speaking of people who were probably teenagers at the time, today's baby boomers, so to speak. But something important, and we need a sociologist on the panel, happened. And I always say, when the movie Harder They Come was released in the Caribbean, when that movie was released, I think that the youth of the Caribbean was so impressed with the Rasta movement that was more or less marginal in Jamaica from the 1930s. So 40 years later, a movie impressed the entire Caribbean out of Jamaica. Or I say out of, there's so much to be said, but mainly out of Jamaica, that we started becoming what we thought were ourselves. So the big afro, the dashiki, and all of that went out the window and was replaced with what we thought was truly Caribbean and more African than we ever knew. So the dreadlocks and whatever replaced the afro and the dashiki. That is my understanding of the transition.
I'm going to have to get a Caribbean sociologist across this because there are so many things within that we need to explore and develop. So now regarding the dashiki, and we all proudly wore our dashikis, and occasionally, I see a Caribbean person in a dashiki, and I'm reminded of that period back in the 70s, as you spoke about there. The dashiki, the word dashiki comes from, and it's spelled Dansiki, and I would think that would mean Dansiki, which is a Yoruba Nigerian loan word from the Hausa, also Nigerian area, that part of West Africa. Dansiki, Danciki, literally meaning shirt or inner garment as compared to the outer garment. You spoke a few minutes back about the wax print when we were talking about the origins of the Madras and whether it originated in India and how much of a Dutch influence there might have been or was with what you referred to as the wax print. I'm correct with that, the wax print, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. So now, the trademark dashiki design was born, and I'm reading this, was born from the Angelina print, a wax print pattern by Dutch designer Toon van de Manica, in my best Dutch, for Netherlands-based company Vlisco, whose designs are inspired by Africa. The exact inspiration for the Angelina print pattern was traditional silk embroidered tunics worn by, wait for this, Ethiopian women. That's the other side of Africa. That's East
Yeah,
Africa.
yeah.
For us in the Caribbean, our African origins, quote unquote, are mainly from West Africa. The Angelina Prince popularity coincided with the release of Ghanaian High Life. Here's your part, Gordon.
Yeah,
Ghanaian High Life hit
yeah.
song Angelina, a name the West African market would begin to call the wax print pattern. So that's why they called it then the Angelina print. In Congo, it would be called Yamamado, and later and later, wait for it, Miriam Makeba. The former being song lyrics of a hit song by a local band that helped popularize the pattern, and the latter being a legendary South African musician who often wore wax prints, and that's Miriam Makeba. You see the linkage? You see how this whole thing comes together in something that quite possibly back in the day we might not have been aware of, and even today, a lot of us might not even be quite aware of. Because, as you correctly said, our dashiki back in the day with our big afros was more directly linked to an African American Black Power coming of age at that time.
Yeah, because I am happy for the links that you were able to research and come up with, because the first Exile One album, I designed the robes that we wore. So they were not um, dashikis, they were my interpretation. And at the time, I didn't know that fashion design was a profession.
You missed your other calling, Gordon.
Yeah, I would say so. But you know, the interesting thing is when we went to Africa, everybody kept on saying, you guys, I remember your first album where you were dressed in Yoruba robes.
And at that time, were you aware of the Yoruba linkage?
I had no idea of who the Yoruba were. Or I didn't know the word Yoruba. It was just my imagination of making a dashiki that would be longer than a shirt. And Africans recognized it as a Yoruba robe. So even now, depending on the interview, I would say our first album we were dressed in Yoruba robes without giving any details. So you see,
Well, I think that inspiration would have come from someplace very, very, very deep, very uh, primordial, to put it that way.
well, I think that at the time there was this group that was part Caribbean, part Ghanaian, I think, Osibisa.
Osibisa, correct, yeah.
Right. And we were very impressed by their music. And occasionally we would see one or two guys dressed with dashikis or something that looked African, or at least what we thought was African. And I decided, but why not robes? Let's wear some robes. And Africans accepted these robes as Yoruba robes.
I think now that we are at the stage where, and I'm looking at the question that you posed 8 years ago, and I'm also looking at what Antigua and Barbuda is doing at an official level today. I think that we are at the stage of not trying to define a Caribbean identity, but to somehow, well, not really trying to find or determine a Caribbean identity, but to somehow codify it. We know it's there, we know what all the elements are, and now we are reviewing a lot of what was, you can't even say handed down from my perspective, what we sort of grabbed onto and tried to make our own. But now we are sort of more aware, better informed, and we can look at something that is a lot more definitively Caribbean. Do you share that view?
I share that view 100%. And it might look like disrespect when someone in today's day might want to disregard certain concepts that were accepted and transmitted from one generation to the next in the past. But I think, like in Dominica, there is a political saying that it was said that by 2020, so it was said sometime back, every Dominican home should have a university graduate. That was one of the ambitions. I don't know if it was accomplished or not, but I would like to think so. So I think that today in Dominica and the other Caribbean islands, we have reached a level where we need to face reality and unlearn some of the traditions and replace them with more logical, more contemplated, more empirical um, evidence and adopt new symbolisms.
And symbolisms are very important because that portrays who you are. A flag is a national symbol. A
Indeed.
national dress is a national symbol. It projects who you are and what you're all about. Gordon Henderson, this is just the first part of our conversation. We need to talk about Exile One, and we need to talk about the evolution of Caribbean music with yourself, not only as a popular, well-established, highly respected band leader with Exile One, but academically as an ethnomusicologist as well. So we'll make a date, set a time for that. I thank you very much. This has been enlightening, inspiring, an eye-opener. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. This has been a great pleasure. I was looking forward to talking to you after so long.